So Eve is saying we have two things that you might think of as each in their own world: nullification to God, awe of God, awe of God, nullification to God. Two separate, beautiful ideas. He says, no. Hey, you're such a chachma. Not two separate things going on here. You developed an awe of God, you developed an vocation. He says this is one issue. So we are in the middle of chapter 43. And in chapter 43, we are discussing a level that we haven't really spoken about before. I mean, briefly, like a long time ago, but a level of a really high nullification to God, a really high awareness of God that's called the higher awe of God. And that is exactly the level we're talking about. So let's just recap a little bit to put ourselves in the structure and the framework, and then we'll keep going. For the first 39 chapters of Tanya, we were focused on primarily loving God, how to access love, then other roads of accessing love, then other types of love, the love I create, the love I have intuitively, innately embedded in my soul, and all different roads to access this. That was, in extreme brevity, the first 39 chapters of Tanya. The first 40 chapters. Starting with chapter 41, we said actually even more fundamental to our relationship with God is fear, is nullification, is reverence, is awe. And that's what we started discussing in chapter 41 and 42, both of which are long. We really delved into this basic awe of God, this basic sense of his power, his presence, his reliance on me, his awareness of me. He's looking at me, he's needing me, and I feel nullified. I have a sense of awe, I have a sense of fear, which inspires my service. Again, that's a very, very brief summary of two very long chapters, 41 and 42. Beginning with 43, we said, you know what, there's actually another level, very, very, very high. We continued the lower level. We spoke some additional concepts within that. When we look at the greatness of creation, that also evokes an awe of God. But if I'm aware of the greatness of creation and that's evoking an awe of God, that's my basic fear, awe, reverence, nullification, as is any of the things we discussed in chapter 41 and 42, because they're all coming from creation. And that's the beginning of our divine service. That's the most natural. Many people don't need to learn Tanya or any Hasidic philosophy to feel this. You look at the world, you look at the power of the world, you look at your vulnerability in the world, and you feel a sense of fear of God. And of course, there's many, many, many levels within this, but that's the basic. And that's the beginning of divine service. Because once we have this, we're motivated to connect to God. So through this basic reverence, this basic awe, this basic fear, I'm motivated to start working. I'm motivated to serve God. I'm motivated to learn his Torah. I'm motivated to do his commandments. And then the process of serving changes me, refines me, sensitizes me, makes me aware that deeper than creation is the godliness within creation. And deeper than the godliness within creation is the Creator. And all of creation is ultimately nullified to the godliness within it. And all of that godliness is nullified to God. And when I think of that, I'm looking at the same creation I was looking at before. But initially, in my first fundamental growth in spirituality, again, I'm saying this just simplistically, sort of overviewing the concepts, I look at the world and it's, wow, such a world, such majesty, such power. I'm so small, it's so big. My vulnerability, its power, fear of God. So I wasn't per se at all aware of the godliness animating anything. I wasn't thinking about that. I wasn't sensitized to that. I was just thinking about the world. And the world itself is enough to evoke in me a fear of God. There's at least outside my house now, a really intense lightning thunderstorm going on. You can imagine experiencing that, especially if you don't have like a nice strong brick house. Maybe you're outside or in a little hut or tent or whatever. And you could really feel that power of world fear of God, or the Rocky Mountains, or the Grand Canyon, or the Niagara Falls, or the world. But that motivated me to serve God. That was the impetus. Enough of an awareness, enough of a sensitization, enough of an awe. As I served, I changed. My service of God changes me. My service of God refines me, sensitizes me to the God within everything. And when I'm focused on the God within, the awe is now coming from a very different level. Because it's not coming from the matter of this world. Power, the might, big lights. It's coming from the fact that there's God within. And everything I see and don't see is nullified to God. So how much more so me? I'm also part of that. If all of creation has this innate nullification to the godliness within, and that godliness in turn has a nullification to God, so what am I? I'm also nullified to God. How am I separate from everything else? Everything has godliness as its core. Me too. Everything has that godliness nullified to God. Me too. So the Rebbe gave us a metaphor. Last week we discussed it. And that metaphor I told you is very classic to Tanya. The Rebbe gives it to us many times in many different ways. In the next section of Tanya, Shayicha Ve'emuna, we analyze it at length. It's like almost like the core of what's discussed for over 12 chapters. Here we're just bringing it in to help us grasp this concept. And then today we're going to give another metaphor that also the Rebbe uses many times in Tanya. So obviously the fact that the Rebbe keeps coming back to these same two metaphors means that better than anything else in the world, they really can give us a grip on these ideas. And these ideas are obviously very spiritual, very mystical, very ethereal, hard to get a grip on, hard to make concrete. And therefore, these are the two best tools we have. So I'm going to remind you of the metaphor from last week, and then we're going to read and learn the second one the Rebbe gives as well. And each one, as we can see, has different advantages in helping our human finite minds grasp very, very, very mystical concepts. So the metaphor we discussed last week is the rays and the sun. And what was said then was that the sun, which is 90 million miles away from here, is the source of planet Earth's light, warmth, heat, energy. This world exists because of its proximity to the sun. More precisely, this world exists because of the precision of its proximity to the sun. If we were closer, we'd burn up. If we were further, there'd be no life. We'd be frozen. So God placed it very precisely that we're exactly close enough and far enough to benefit from the sun without getting harmed by the sun. How precisely are we getting the sun's energy? As we said, the sun is 90 million miles away from planet Earth. Well, the sun has rays. Obviously, over those 90 million miles, the rays are getting weaker and weaker, but they're still strong enough to give us all of our light, heat, warmth, energy, get it all from these rays, weakened by their 90 million mile journey, but still exactly what we need. So therefore, in our world, those rays are incredibly significant. There's a source of light. It's our day and our night. There's a source of warmth, of heat, of energy. We literally, the planet could not exist without them. It couldn't have any life on it without them. Now let's travel back those 90 million miles. As we travel back in our spaceship, we see the rays are getting stronger and stronger and stronger. They're more powerful and more powerful and more powerful. Obviously, the closer they get back to their source, they get more and more powerful. And they're getting more powerful and more powerful and more powerful. And then we get to the sun and we don't see the rays at all. They cease to exist. The rays, which have such power that 90 million miles away, they can fuel an entire planet of 8 billion people, have no existence. They cannot be seen by the sun at all. Why? Because they're in their source. And in their source, these ultra powerful rays are nothing. They're nothing. Don't exist at all because of the far, far more intense power of planet sun herself. So that is the model. Now, obviously, the advantage of this metaphor is it's very concrete. It's very physical. We all know what a sun is. We all know what the rays of the sun are. I mean, we can draw it. We probably did since we were like 3 or 4 or 2. So we all can totally get what this concept is saying in a very concrete way. Let me show it very clearly as the metaphor and what it's representing. We have the rays that seemingly have tremendous power, but when they're in their source, the sun, which has far more power, they don't exist at all. We have everything of this world that seemingly has a lot of power. And this world doesn't just mean Chicago or planet Earth. It means everything in the Milky Way galaxy. Anything in creation that I know of and that we don't know of. All of creation. That's a lot of power. Like the rays have a lot of power. But in contrast to their source, the godliness within, and the God within that godliness, they're not. The rays have no existence by the sun. Creation is nothing in its source. Now, unlike the rays and the sun, where we do have the concept of the rays not being by their source, traveling from their source, like we said, 90 million miles away, here's us, creation is never not by its source. Creation is always within its source, the godliness, which always is within its source, God himself. So therefore, all of creation constantly is completely nullified to the godliness, completely nullified to God. It has truly no real existence, no real substance, which is part of the reason why God is constantly recreating and recreating and recreating all of creation every second, because it truly doesn't have substance out of the God that's constantly recreating it. So that metaphor was to make clear to us that we could look at something and say, how are you saying this world is nothing? How are you saying this world is completely nullified to the God energy? This world seems so substantial. Well, so do the rays of the sun. They really seem very substantial. But in their source, they're nothing, don't exist. And so too, all of creation, which is always in its source, has this constant nullification to God. And then the takeaway is, and me too. So now we're going to continue this thought with the second metaphor that the Rebbe also gives, not as extensively as this first one, but also in certain places in Tanya develops it at tremendous length. Now, neither of these we are developing at tremendous length. We are bringing them in to have a tool like scaffolding for ourselves to be able to fathom and try to stretch to this idea of this upper awe of God, this very sublime level of such a sense of God that there's such a lack of existence of self, which, if you remember Kabbalistically, that's called bitul b'mitzias. When there's such nullification, we totally lose our existence within the God energy. Now, we have plenty of existence. You don't have to worry that you're going to lose yourself. But the more we think about these ideas, the more we can, on our own level, assimilate them, absorb them. And I think how it practically plays out in our life is the more we really feel it's all God. There's nothing but God. Everything is nullified to the godliness, everything. So you know what? This world is a lot safer than I thought. You could read something sometimes and hear something sometimes, and it doesn't feel that safe. It doesn't feel that secure. And then you're like, wait, nothing has any independent reality. Nothing has any reality outside of God's reality. Oh, okay. The world is secure. We're with God. We're good. We are on the bottom of page 122. The canal barichos, b'derech mashal, minefesh ha'adam. And just as in chapter 20 and 21, we spoke at length a different metaphor from the soul of man, shedibur echad, that one word, one speech, midiburo machshavto, from his speech, from his thoughts, kiloma mashchule, is like nothing. So the Rebbe there is just alluding, as the Rebbe says, to a concept that he told us about a lot for 2 chapters, 21 and 22 and 20 as well. What is the concept? Because if you didn't know the previous chapters, you would not understand what the Rebbe is saying from this. But good news, we learned it before, so we know what the Rebbe is talking about. So this is another metaphor, the power of speech. When we speak, our words are coming from our power of speech. Our power of speech comes from our power of thought. We all know about Freudian slips, right? So we could think, no, we were just mindlessly, blabbling and blabbling on. But actually, according to Hasidus, everything you say, you have to think. Otherwise, you can't even say it. So I'm speaking a word. The word comes from my power of speech, my ability to speak, which comes from my power of thought. Well, where does my power of thought come? Well, now I go deeper into my soul, and it comes from the powers of emotion and the powers of intellect of my soul. Where does that come from? Well, that comes from the core godliness of my soul itself. So I have my speech coming from my power of speech, coming from my power of thought, coming from the powers of my soul, coming from the godliness of my soul. So what's that one word? Like nothing. What's that word in contrast to my complete ability to speak? Nothing. We can talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. What was that one word? And what's that power of speech in contrast to my power of thought? My power of thought, which also is language based, according to Hasidic philosophy, we think in words. So the richer my vocabulary base, the more I have abilities to express myself in my thoughts, but it's much more fluid than my verbal speech. The letters of thought are much more refined than the letters of concrete speech. So it's even more nothing, that word, from the power of speech to the power of thought. And what's the power of thought compared to my soul powers? And what are my soul powers compared to the godliness within? So what's that one word compared to its source? The godliness of my soul. Nothing. So this is another way of trying to understand. And again, the fact that the Rebbe gave us two metaphors is because it's not so easy to understand, but we can do it. Sometimes we just say, oh, let me just take it on faith. The Rebbe says, no problem, but try to understand. And sometimes we understand something and then we stop understanding it, but then we understand it again and then we lose it a little. And that's all the process of being humans trying to grasp God. So creation, vis-a-vis creator, like that word, in contrast to 5 levels before its real source, that power of godliness of my very soul. So this metaphor might be harder for you to understand than the rays in the sun, because the rays in the sun are really concrete. I mean, of course, we know all about speech and we do it all the time, but we're not as consciously seeing that this word comes from my power of speech, which comes from my power of thought, which comes from the power of my soul, which comes from the godliness of my soul. On the other hand, there's a very strong power to this metaphor. And a very big advantage of this metaphor is that all of creation is God's speech. God speaks, and it is. God's been speaking for 5,784 years and counting. And second by second, as he speaks, worlds exist. All of the spiritual world and all of the physical worlds exist by virtue of the speech of God. And therefore, when we think of this metaphor of speech and how that word is nothing compared to the godliness within the soul of a human, you imagine God's speech compared to God? And all of creation is God's speech. Again, I'm finite. My speech is finite and I'm finite. And yet that one word, and I'm still finite, is nothing compared to my core powers. God's infinite. What's a word of God compared to the infinity of God himself? If by me it's nothing, what is it by God? And all of creation is God's speech. So that's, I think, a very strong power of this second metaphor. So you could sort of think of both, and each one can give you a different aha in processing that creation has no existence outside of its nullification to God's existence. And why do I care? Then I apply it to myself. And I'm like, and I'm also part of creation. And what is my existence outside of my relationship to God? Any questions, any reflections on any of this? Okay, so we'll go on, and please feel totally free to ask questions, or if you want to.
Oh, I have a question.
Okay, Esther, thank you.
Okay, well, it's not such a big question.
Okay.
But anyway, all right, when we speak as Chabad Hasidic women, we speak in an elevated way, I think. Our thoughts are good and our speech is in a refined way. But let's say for those who don't, like whatever, secular people or whatever, when they use speech that is outside of the realm of holiness, then, well, what's that all about, in other words? I mean, I'm used to every now and then you go somewhere public and you hear something that it's like, wow, why is your head in the toilet,
Esther, if
So
I'm
what's
understanding your
this all
question,
about?
your question, I think this is what your question is, but I want to say it back to you to make sure I understood it. Is your question that I'm saying all speech ultimately goes back to our powers of soul, but you're saying in the world around us, there's a lot of speech that doesn't seem to be emanating from their powers of soul? Is that your question?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
That's a great question. That's a really, really, really good question. It's a very deep question. It shows you really understood the concept. And what's my answer? I wish my answer was as good as your question. I would say, first of all, we have to discriminate between Jews and non-Jews because you're talking about the world
Right.
around you, and the bulk of the world around us is non-Jews.
But
But
unfortunately, there are Jews out there that are not in the realm of being leading a Tordic life, and but yet their neshama is pure. So, like, what's going on with that? Why does this come out of them? It's their Yetzer Hara, or what?
okay, so let's first discriminate. We've got non-Jews and we've got Jews. Obviously, there's 8 billion non-Jews, within which there are 15 million or so Jews. So for the
Right.
majority of the world, obviously their speech, as you're saying correctly, is not sourced in their godly soul because they don't have a godly soul. So
Right.
their speech ultimately goes back to their animal soul powers. That's their spiritual source. They don't have another spiritual source. So it's still a spiritual source. It's their spiritual source. In terms of Jewish people, that's a very interesting question you're raising, which any Jew, of course, all of us included, could say sometimes words that seem very highly unlikely to be sourced in a godly place, because why would we be gossiping from a godly place? Why would we be lying from a godly place? Why would we be making fun of someone from a godly place? I mean, there's lots of words we say that we think probably aren't really coming from such a godly place. So, again, on the surface, all of those words are really coming from the animal soul, just as with any non Jew. His words are coming from his animal soul. So, also in us, when we are choosing to say something inappropriate, just the same way as we're choosing to think something inappropriate or to do something inappropriate or to feel something inappropriate, it means that our animal soul won that fight, has taken control for this millisecond, and it is now the source. And therefore, our words ultimately go back to that. Now, it's interesting what you're saying based on this metaphor the Rebbe is giving. So, is the Rebbe only assuming that we're in a godly space, and that's why he's tracing back the words to our godly source? Maybe. Or maybe we have to understand a little more deeply that the animal soul has no energy of its own. So, the animal soul of a Jew is really getting its power from the godly soul. It's, if you will, usurping power from the godly soul. So even when a Jew is saying something inappropriate, wrong, forbidden, which means we would say the word to the source of words, to the source of thoughts, to the powers of animal soul, to the animal soul herself, but the animal soul, in essence, is feeding off the godly soul. So therefore, it still does have a connection to the godly soul. Not in a positive way, because we don't want the animal soul to be siphoning off the godly soul and taking her energies. But that's in essence what happens, especially when we do the wrong thing and sin. That's actually exactly what happens when we sin. That was a
Well,
really good
maybe
question.
in
That was not a side question. That was not a small question. That was a good question that showed you really understood the metaphor.
maybe thank you. Maybe as far as the non-Jews concerned, if they're in the seven Noahide laws and following it, then they're at a higher level. But let's say a Jew at a low level is most likely higher than a Goy at their highest level unless they're doing the Noahide laws.
So, yes, a Jew, even a Jew who's sinning, has a godly soul. And that godly soul is ultimately the core of that Jew. A non Jew, even a non Jew keeping the Noahide laws, does not have a godly soul. A non Jew keeping the Noahide laws has a animal soul of a different nature than a regular non Jew. So the godliness is accessible, but they don't have a godly soul. That's only for.
Wow. Baruch Hashem, we're Chabad Hasidim.
All right. So continuing, and yes, Baruch Hashem.
Thank you.
So based on all this, the Rebbe says, "V'zeh shamar hakasuv, hein yiras Hashem hi chachma." Now, this is a quote from Eov. The quote says, "Behold, fear of God is wisdom." Okay, if you fear God, you're truly wise because that's where it's at. But we've learned a whole page of chapter 43 of Tanya. So we understand there's other more deeper messages going on here, because we by now know that that word chachma, wisdom, is a code word for nullification to God. So we're not taking away the superficial surface meaning of the words. That's true. Hen yiras Hashem hi chachma. True wisdom is fearing God, and that's 100% true, and you're at your wisest when you're fearing God. Absolutely correct. At the same time, on a deeper, more mystical level, Eve is saying, Yiras Hashem, a true, ultimate awe of God, this very sublime level of awe that we've been discussing, what we call Yira Ila'ah, this upper, supernal awe of God, that is Chachma, remember? We broke down to complete, absolute nullification to God. So Eve is saying we have two things that you might think of as each in their own world. Nullification to God, awe of God. Awe of God, nullification to God. Two separate, beautiful ideas. He says, no. Hey, yiras Hashem hi chachma. Not two separate things going on here. You developed an awe of God, you developed nullification. He says this is one issue, which we now understand. And you could almost say, like, which leads to which, but the way we're going here in this road, as we nullify ourselves, as we think and are sensitized and are aware, just as the world, so to me, what am I, if not a being within which there's this godliness that I'm nullified to, and that godliness itself is nullified to God. And as a Jew, as Esther just questioned and I just explained, it's even more so. What is my reality? The reality of every Jew is a godly soul. That's the real I of every single one of us, godliness. So that nullification in the code word of the verse, chachma, that translates to automatically absolute awe of God. Complete awe of God is complete nullification. Complete nullification is complete awe of God. It's one concept with the help of everything we've learned so far in this chapter. The Rebbe says, but you can't jump the ladder. You can't suddenly get this level of awe, this level of nullification, only through service of God, studying his Torah, keeping his commandments, through the basic foundational fear of God, awe of God that we discussed in chapter 41 and 42. And this is what's written. We have had this before, and now we're going to have it again, slightly differently. Im ein yira, ein chachma. If there's no fear, there is no wisdom. This is like the third time we've discussed this. So what is the Rebbe adding here? The Rebbe is saying, I am telling you about this amazingly high reality a human could transcend himself, transcend physicality, really, to achieve. A level where you look and you sense and you're aware and you're focused on the godliness within. And more than that, you're aware that everything is nullified to the godliness within. And more than that, you look at yourself and you are the same. You're also nullified to the godliness within. Imagine walking around with that reality. Wow. Even saying it and trying to think about it for a little bit is like, wow. There's this, how do we get there? We get there by climbing the ladder of service of God. As I said in the beginning of the class, we start out with a basic natural fear of God, a very human experience. As I said, you don't have to learn a lot of Hasidic philosophy to have a fear of God. It's the most natural relationship man has with God is fear, is awe, is reverence. That's how we start off. And when you start off with that, you serve. And as we serve, we change. The process of serving, and as we want to bring in the ideas of Tanya, thinking of God's power, thinking of God's presence, thinking of God watching me, thinking of God needing me, thinking of God's powers of creation. This all inspires my service. God is so great, and God has such need for me, and God's watching me, and needing me, and wanting me to serve him. And as I serve him, I change. Sometimes it's hard to see it in ourselves. Sometimes it's obvious enough that we do see it in ourselves. And sometimes the best way is if we give ourselves like a lot of years to look back. Like maybe for someone who became a Baal Tshuva, returned to Judaism at a certain point in their life, sort of easier to think of, well, how I used to be versus how I am now, though however many years it is later. But also someone who's been Orthodox their whole life can also look and see as they grow how I used to be, how I changed. If you can't find any change, that's a little scary. That's actually impossible. It just might mean you're not, it's not obvious enough, or you're not good at this self-awareness stuff. But really, we should be able to look and find ways we changed. Changed. What does that mean? We became more refined, became more spiritually sensitive. Hopefully, we're nicer humans. We're more menschlich. We're more aware and sensitive to other people. We're more aware and sensitive to God. In other words, the process of service is not only us giving to God, it's us being impacted by the godliness we're immersing ourselves in. At the end of what we call Tanya, this first work in this book, Likutei Amarim, which is 53 chapters, we're in chapter 43 of the 53. So at the end of that 53rd chapter, the final vision the Alter Rebbe leaves us with is a wick with a flame. The wick is in a pool of wax, a pool of oil, so the flame is on the wick. And as the flame maintains itself on the wick, the flame is charring the wick. Of course, we all know that. I mean, we see that anytime we light a candle. The Rebbe says that's us. Because as the flame of God is on the body of man, is on the animal of man, our impurities are charred away. It's a process. It's a lifelong process. But literally, day by day, commandment by commandment, study of Torah by study of Torah, the flame of God on the wick of man, our impurities are charred away. They're burnt away by that fire, which means we change. And as we change, we become more and more spiritually sensitive. And I'm sure all of us can really see that. Maybe there was something you heard about at one point and you're like, oh my gosh, like no way, that I would never do. And maybe now 20 years later you're doing it. Or anything along those lines, or in so many different ways. Maybe prayer has become more meaningful over time, maybe saying Tehillim, Psalms. Maybe Torah study reaches you more and resonates more. Maybe certain commandments reach you more and resonate more. But bit by bit, as the junk gets charred away, we're more and more spiritually open. Our pores are getting cleansed out of the junk, and we more and more sensitized to spirituality. I've definitely seen that process. I assume everyone here has on some level. I don't like to share. Anyone can think of something in themselves that made it very clear to them that change. Oh, sometimes it's more personal, so the ways we change. But I sincerely hope everyone can think of ways they have changed through the process of immersion and serving God. The Rebbe says you started off with this basic awareness, fear, awe, which inspired you to serve. The service is changed. As you serve, you become more and more God sensitized. And through that, you're able to access this higher relationship. Because you can't just start like cold turkey, so to speak, with this higher relationship. It's got nothing to do with you. You don't even relate to it. But as we serve, we more and more and more can relate to this, can relate to the world's being nullified to God, can relate to our own nullification to God. And therefore, as it says in Pirkei Avos, in Ethics of the Fathers, as we've said before, im ein yira ein chachma, which, again, on the surface means if there's no fear, there's no wisdom, which is true. But here the Rebbe is saying, again, what's real wisdom? Nullification to God. Imen yira. If you don't start off with that basic yira tata, basic fear, basic awe, basic reverence, you can never access real wisdom, real nullification to God, because you need that basic fear to get you to do the divine service through which you could ascend to the chachma, to the nullification of God, of this higher level relationship of yira ila'ah, of this higher awe of God. So it's interesting because we've had this before. First we said, I mean, yira in chachma, and that was what was chachma? Chachma was Torah. Now we're saying, what's chachma? Chachma is nullification. This is actually the second way we've looked at this and said chachma is nullification. Now we're saying, Imen yira, without that basic fear, I can never I can never walk the road of true, absolute nullification to God. Any questions on any of this? Any thoughts, any reflections? Any ways you see how it relates to you personally? How personally you can apply it?
Would you say that, let's say in the case of a person who hasn't really developed that fear, that awe, and let's say as they go through life, through the years, they start learning that it really is Hashem who's in charge of everything. Let's say after this person goes through different knocks and squeezings and all sorts of things, then they develop that fear in that way because of what they've been through. So that seems to be, I wouldn't say it's the easier way, but maybe it's a more clear-cut realization than just developing the fears that your life is just seems to be going along the way you would like it to go along. So isn't that
That's a road, but what you're saying is still what we call the lower fear. In other words, what you're saying, which is absolutely true, is that maybe sometimes if a person doesn't come to it on their own, God could send challenges and situations that makes a person feel their vulnerability, feel their dependency on God. And that could help them create a fear of God, an awe of God, a nullification to God. Absolutely. And that, of course, happens all the time. I agree with you. We'd rather start off by having it innately and working with it and not needing to any of the lessons of life to teach us that. But sometimes, yeah, that's the road. But that road is creating the foundational, what we call Kabbalistically, the lower fear, the lower awe. Because if things happened in your life and now you realize how vulnerable you really are, that's the lower fear. The higher fear, which is what we're talking about here, is this sense of the nothingness of all, because all is nullified to the God within. Everything means planet Earth, everything means the Milky Way galaxy, everything means the highest angels, everything is all nullified to its source, to the godliness and to the God within. So that's the space of the upper fear. The lower fear is seeing the powers of this world. I feel vulnerable. I feel small. I feel needy. I need protection. I need security. I need God. That's all true and valid, and we need it, and it's the lower fear. So if a person, what you're saying, Esther, if I'm understanding you correctly, is a person who's not in touch with his own innate fear of God for whatever acculturation, reasons, education, whatever, lack of sensitivity intently to the forces of God within, so he doesn't even feel this basic fear of God. And then life teaches him. Absolutely. 100%. That's a road. But what life is teaching him is he's vulnerable, he's needy, he's dependent on God. And that's the lower fear. And then he begins serving God. And then through serving God, he can become more and more sensitized to begin ascending to this upper fear, this upper awe, this very exalted sense of all is nullified within its God reality. So it's not like a sense of, I mean, trying to translate this practically. In the lower fear, I can feel I'm very vulnerable. I'm very needy. I need God. I need his powers. I need his blessings. I need his protection. I need his strength. I need his security. I need all of that. I do. That's all the lower fear. In the upper fear, I'm feeling I'm just an extension. What's I? I'm an extension of God's energy, as is everything. Everything that I look at that seems to have so much substance and reality is just veering extensions of godliness.
So it seems that the healthy way to go is to have a balance of both.
Ultimately, it would be awesome to have
Lower and the higher, or only the higher?
you
Is that the
when you
goal?
get the higher, you don't lose the lower. But for most people start off with the lower, and then gradually, they could work on getting the higher. The higher is this high. So it's not like, which should I do today? The higher is a high service, but we can try to assimilate it as much as possible while foundationally we have the lower one.
So then how does one actually think when they're in the higher realm?
When you're really completely in the higher realm, you're feeling
Right?
that everything is godliness. It's a very like Mashiach style experience because by Mashiach, we'll look at the world, everything we're going to look at, your cell phone or computer or your phone, whatever you're looking at, you're going to sense the God energy in it. Doesn't mean you won't see it. You won't be able to, you won't lose yours in the crowd because you can't even see it. No, you can see it. But what's going to be overwhelming is the God energy. And everything else is not as significant, not so important. What's real, what's tangible, what's substantial is the God energy in it. And when a person is in this space, this really entrenched, like really there, not just like trying to get a touch of it, but really there, that's what they're experiencing. Not like by Mashiach when you see it, but they're experiencing it in their mind's eye. Everywhere they look, they're conscious of the godliness within. It says that the Alter Rebbe, author of the Tanya, this work we're studying right now, and on the night of his passing, he was like looking at the beams of the ceiling, and someone there asked him, what does he see? He's like staring at the beams. And he said, I see the godliness. You see beams, I see godliness. Or similar, different, but very similar theme. Once the Alter Rebbe was speaking with his son, who became the Rebbe after him, and he asked him a certain time of prayers, what was he intending? And he said all of his intentions, very, very high, exalted, Kabbalistic intentions. And then he asked his father, and what was my father, what was the Rebbe thinking about during those words of prayer? And he said, I was contemplating the stender. I was contemplating what my siddur was leaning on, that piece of wood, because when he was looking at the wood, he was contemplating the godliness within it. So that's this level that we look at the world and what we're absorbing, what we see as there is God energy. Now,
Well, I want to
we're about a
you for
million miles away from that, but the fact that the Rebbe is telling it to us in Tanya means even as we think about these concepts and as we're thinking about them and thinking about ourselves, we're beginning this journey. We're getting a little more, a little more, a little more of this sensitivity that within all is God. And as I said, trying to make this very practical, to me, how it practically translates is when I look around the world, like after I learn Tanya, maybe tonight after this class, it'll last for a while. I look around the world, and in my life, I could look at things, and they can be intimidating, they could be scary, they could be things that could concern me, could evoke fear. And I'm like, it's all God. It's all God. You can think about what's going on in our world and all the realities that have been going on very prevalently since October 7th, and you're like, it's all God. Not just
And for
it's
me,
this world
October
that keeps
9th.
running it, but it's God. Literally within the energy of everything going on, it's
Right.
God.
And for me, it's October 9.
Right.
I wanted to thank you because I um, have a different perception of the sunset. Like when you said that the sun and all the planets are bowing to God. So I look at the sun and think of it as bowing when it's in the sun, when it's going down. It's just like a gradual bowing to Hashem in the west.
That's exactly what's happening. And every time you think about that, you're living chapter 42 of Tanya.
Well, thank you. Thank you for bringing that to my awareness.
Can you say that the more you can get in tune to your neshama, the more, because that's the essence, I mean, your essence connection with God, the more you could tune into that, the more you could experience that nullification?
Absolutely. Which is a different way of what the Rebbe is saying, that the more you serve, the more you study Torah and the more you do the commandments, the more naturally you can be in that space. And as you study Torah and do the commandments, you're more and more in tune with your soul. Your soul has more and more ability to shine and impact you. Absolutely.